Congratulations, you're the new winner of the award for hardest person to pick recommendations for. Your four favorites are Night is Short, Walk On Girl, Godzilla, Mothra, and King Ghidorah, Giant Monsters, All Out Attack, Pulse, and The Life Aquatic with Steve Zissou. I'm gonna shorten some of these titles, so I'm abbreviating the Godzilla movie as GMK. You've seen over 4,000 movies, including all of my top choices and basically every Godzilla movie ever made, and pretty much every monster movie that I think is worth recommending was already marked as watched. So I'm gonna outline the connections in your favorites that I can actually work with, and then I'll just refer back to those ideas when I list the movies I want to recommend. The first three films in your favorites are Japanese movies. Night is Short and Life Aquatic are both fun and whimsical. GMK and Pulse both involve some sort of haunting or ghost, because in this particular Godzilla film, Godzilla is the manifestation of the restless souls of those who were killed during the Pacific War. GMK and Pulse both involve science or technology. There's a filmmaking component to both GMK and Life Aquatic. There are themes of vengeance in your favorites because those souls powering Godzilla are vengeful spirits, and Steve Zissou has sworn vengeance upon the jaguar shark that killed his best friend. And there are themes of loneliness and grief because the characters in Pulse are very isolated and dealing with death, and Steve Zissou is learning to live with the grief of losing his best friend. So my top choice for you is The Discarnates. It's a Japanese film. It has a dreamlike quality like Night is Short. Like GMK, there's that haunting feeling. Like Pulse, it's a horror film involving ghosts and loneliness. And like The Life Aquatic, a character reunites with his father, and it's about learning to live with grief. Kwaidan is also a Japanese film. It feels comparable to Night is Short in an episodic way because it's an anthology film consisting of 4 separate stories. And even though Night is Short isn't an anthology, the encounters that occur throughout that night feel like their own unique stories. Like GMK, the past refuses to stay buried and comes back in symbolic or supernatural forms. Like Pulse, it's a horror film with a ghostly atmosphere. And like The Life Aquatic, there are themes of vengeance and grief. Angel Dust is another Japanese film. Like Night is Short, it makes navigating the city feel almost surreal. Like GMK, it feels like some of the characters are being controlled by unseen forces. And like Pulse, it's a horror film with characters who feel isolated. Another one of my top choices for you is The Wolf House. It's an animated film that feels kind of surreal like Night is Short. Like GMK, it draws inspiration from real-life tragedies. Like Pulse, it's a horror film that's driven by an unsettling atmosphere, and it uses stop-motion animation like the jaguar shark in Life Aquatic. Dead Talent Society has a playful tone like Night is Short. It involves the undead like GMK, specifically ghosts like Pulse. And it's a horror film like Pulse, but also a comedy like Life Aquatic. Happy End is a Japanese film like 3 of your favorites. Like GMK, it's science fiction and calls into question Japan's political and historical past. And like Pulse, it makes a statement about technology. Je t'aime is whimsical and chaotic like Night is Short and Life Aquatic. It's sci-fi like GMK and deals with loneliness like Pulse. And it involves romance like Night is Short. Everything I just said also applies to the science of sleep, but this one is more fantasy than sci-fi, but it has a surreal, dreamlike quality to it like Night is Short. Speaking of whimsical and chaotic movies, a couple other films that I think have that same playful energy like Night is Short are Daisies and Kamikaze Girls. A few other Japanese films involving vengeful spirits like GMK or ghosts like Pulse are Kuroneko and Samurai Reincarnation. Since the internet is a big part of Pulse, I was thinking of other horror movies that revolve around screens, whether it's computers, phones, or cameras, and I want to recommend Rapture, Red Rooms, Lake Mungo, and Thesis. The Girl Who Leapt Through Time is an anime film with a playful tone that involves romance like Night is Short. It's sci-fi like GMK. It's whimsical like Life Aquatic. And like Pulse, there's a sort of isolated feeling and desire for human connection. Except in Pulse, it felt like the internet, which is supposed to bring us closer together, is what's making people feel more disconnected. And in this film, the thing that feels like it's separating people is time. I wanted to recommend at least one monster movie since you've got a Godzilla movie in your favorites, and I think the only ones I wrote down that you didn't have marked as watched were The Thing from Another World and The Wolfman. Venus Wars is an anime film like Night is Short. It's sci-fi like GMK. Like Pulse, it feels like technology is making people feel disconnected from each other, except in this film, the technology is more futuristic and dystopian. And this movie has a sense of adventure like Life Aquatic. Rubber's Lover is a Japanese film like 3 of your favorites. And it's a horror film like Pulse and sci-fi like GMK. I've heard people say Life Aquatic is Wes Anderson's 8.5, and I never really thought to make that comparison myself. But there are a few shots in The Life Aquatic that I think were clearly inspired by 8.5. And this movie is about a filmmaker, which fits in with the filmmaking aspect of GMK and Life Aquatic. Speaking of which, a couple other classic films that you didn't have marked as watched that are referenced in Life Aquatic are Jules and Jim and Fitzcarraldo.